Hey y'all, this is Nicole Johnson with Call to Create, and today I have with me Josh Philipp, host of Crossroads from the Epic Times. And you guys might know him from that show, but today I wanted to talk to him about his poetic society that he started in creativity and poetry. So let's get into that. So, how did you go about starting this poetic society?
Yeah, well, Nicole, thank you for having me. And yeah, it's funny. I do a lot of interviews. Nobody ever wants to talk about my poetry society. I think maybe not many people know I even have it actually. But yeah, I'm the co-founder of the Society of Classical Poets, and I think me and a friend started it. Evan Mantic. He's the current president of the society. I'm still like the CTO because I help with the back end website sometimes.
Yeah.
But it started back, I think, it must have been like 2010 or 2011. I don't even remember the year now. It was a long time ago now. I've been with Epic Times since 2006, so it's been a long time there too.
Yeah.
But me and a friend were sitting down, and I enjoyed writing poetry. In fact, poetry was one of the ways where I taught myself new writing skills. I have a lot of theories about the value of poetry with writing.
Uh-huh.
And so my writing style is actually more poetic than modern conventional, actually. And there's a lot behind that, I think. But, aside from that point, I used to write a lot of poetry. I never published most of it. Most of it is just personal stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I was at the time looking to publish it. And I was told by people who work at poetry journals that they will not accept rhyming poetry.
Really?
I was like, what do you mean you won't accept rhyming poetry? They're like, yeah, it's just free verse and that's about it.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody wants to read, they said, or nobody wants to write, I think, rhyming poetry. And I was like, well, that's odd. Where can you go? And I found out there really wasn't a place. And so a friend and I were talking about this because he's also a poet. And we said, what if we created a poetry society that tries to uphold traditional forms of poetry? Like, hey, let's do it. So what we did was we built the Society of Classical Poets, which is more like we publish new poetry using classical forms. And if you were to ask me, I think one of the reasons why people find poetry uninteresting these days is two reasons. One is that it's mostly just people just ranting. If you go to a lot of poetry journals, and I'm not offending people. I don't mean anything bad. If you want to write poetry like this, but they're writing prose. They're not writing poetry. They're writing prose, and it's just basically them just going on emotional tangents.
Kind of like stream of consciousness.
The stream of consciousness, or just like emotional stuff. You know what I mean? And I respect them fine, but I would like to have a place too where you can write rhyming poetry, and I think there's something important in that. If you want, I can get into my theories about that, but there's something that the ear recognizes with certain patterns and certain sounds. It's why, ironically, one of the few places you can still find a lot of classical poetry styles is music. Not even just forms to some extent, and at the very least rhymes, but even like beats and so on that do play into traditional poetry. And I think it's these things that make poetry interesting. That is one big side of it. The other big side of it is poetry that actually people can relate to. I think the mistake a lot of people make when they do classical poetry, which maybe I'm guilty of too, is they like to write it like they're in the 1400s or something like that. They don't write it. They don't write it for modern people. So the Society of Classical Poets, while we do a lot on traditional values and classical stories and mythology, we also have a lot that's even like political commentary, where people can write poetry that's relevant to like today's world. And so the idea of the society was to kind of restore what poetry used to be, just put simply.
Yeah. Okay, so you're talking about like your theories and the value of poetry. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah. So anyone curious, the website is classicalpoets.org. I don't make any money from it. Never made a penny on it that I can think of. It's a nonprofit. They do contests every year. They do take donations, but almost all of it goes into the awards for the poetry contest. It's just a passion project. A few of my friends and I do.
That's fun.
But it actually has a good readership, and actually does have pretty decent influence among the poetry community, which is nice. In my opinion, kind of having that kind of community it is what makes it useful. We never really thought about making a living off it, nor do I think any of us are trying to, you know. But, you know, aside from that, you know, we do a journal every year and so on. When it comes to poetry, this is my theory. And this kind of relates to a lot of classical writings. I'm a big fan of classics, ancient books, mythologies, folk tales, and so on. In fact, this shelf here, almost all of these are folk tales.
That's awesome.
I remember when I first started Crossroads, actually, my show at Epic TV, some people were kind of making fun of me because I had, like, you know, usually when people do like news shows, they have, like, you know, news books behind them. I had like mythology and stuff. Like, I think someone was laughing at me because I had like a Winnie the Pooh collection.
Well, you're just staying true to you. I love that.
You know, it was either Tolkien. Was it Tolkien who said, you know, one day you'll be old enough again to enjoy fairy tales?
C.S. Lewis.
That was C.S. Lewis, yeah. But anyways, I'm a big fan of classical books. So those of you curious, these are mostly mythology, folk tales and mythology. Up here is another shelf that's all mythology. Some of these are just random stuff I recently picked up. I found copies, for example, of 1984 that actually has George Orwell's the Index. When you get into, I believe it's the Index, he actually explains his theories, which the modern publishings of it do not have that.
Oh, that's
which
cool.
is crazy. And then these are history books, and then if you get into these are Chinese classics. These are mostly Roman, medieval class. Then above that is medieval classics. Then I have some American classics.
Nice.
Down here is Japanese and other just random countries. And then I have another shelf over there that's just kind of more random books. Behind the camera, I have a huge shelf of political books, and another one that's more just unorganized random books. And then I have random piles of books. In fact, I've been researching for a new documentary that I haven't announced yet. And I have a huge pile of KGB books as well. I probably have 10 or 15 of them. So, but, you know, I'm on a tangent. But, you know, aside from that, yeah, so I do read a lot of mythology. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to think of the nature of poetry. Mm-hmm. Because poetry, while we tend to view it as kind of like very frilly and, you know, almost feminine these days, in the past it was viewed as masculine. Mm. Poetry was considered a masculine art. And I can explain a bit more of that because people maybe, when you get into these cultures, maybe we have different concepts of what that means. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? I'll give you a few examples of it. If you talk about, for example, classical Chinese views on music, they would say that you need to have a balance of yin and yang, mm-hmm. masculine and feminine, which they believe, you know, pervades everything, essentially. That harmony exists in the balance between the two. Taoism would talk about this. A lot of the traditional religions would talk about this. Even in the West, the golden mean, to an extent, goes into this kind of theory. If you apply it to like music, for example, they'd say that if you're tuning a guitar, if you make it too tight, which would be more masculine, it's going to be high pitched and brittle. The strings can break, in fact, if you tie them too tightly. And you see that nature in men where they can become so rigid sometimes that they become almost brittle. Mm-hmm. Their minds can break to some extent. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think women can recognize that they have a natural talent at kind of talking men down from the cliff. Just by listening to men, they can help men kind of find peace with their own thoughts. A man's mind can tear him apart from the inside. A woman's emotions do the same thing to her, and a man can, talking to her, kind of help her find reason.
Yes.
Talk her down from the cliff. Yes. You know what I mean? But, you know, traditional wisdom would say that men and women both have these elements within them. Just one is primary, one is secondary in terms of whether you're a man or a woman. Back to the instrument. So I talked about if you tune it too tightly, right? It's brittle, it's high-pitched, it's not pleasant. If you tune it too low, it's too loose, and it can't make a sound. Mm-hmm. And, you know, that's kind of like the over-feminine, right? The proper tuning requires a balance between the two, between masculine and feminine, between yin and yang. If you get into poetry and prose prose being what we normally write in, prose being a formalist type of writing.
Mm-hmm.
You would say that, and this is just, traditional theories. I'm not saying this is the way things are, definitely, but I'm just saying based on traditional theories. The realm of the mind, the logic and so on, they would say is more like a masculine thing, whereas the realm of emotions is more like a feminine thing, right? Of course, not saying men and women don't both have these.
Mm-hmm.
Again, traditional belief would say that they're both each contain it, of course, but aside from the point, prose is unformed. Prose is like a very loose form.
Mm-hmm.
Prose is like, it's formless, it's structureless, you can kind of say whatever you want. But because of that loose form, it can bring order and balance to the real sharp intellect. And so that's why typically when we use prose as a writing form, it's good for communicating ideas, and it's good for kind of bringing a balance and, communicating our deeper thoughts and so on, right? Which is the way we often use it. Poetry is no longer appreciated. Poetry does the opposite. Poetry is structured. Poetry is rigid. Poetry makes you think differently of how to say things, right?
Mm-hmm.
It brings order to that, like, emotional world, in other words.
Yeah.
The feminine world of emotions, poetry brings order to it. And this is why, for example, I have a book of Japanese death poems, for example, which sounds morbid,
Yeah.
but hear me out. Is they would say that if you're feeling sad, write a poem about it. If you're having trouble dealing with a circumstance, write a poem about it.
Mm.
If you're going through an emotional conflict, write a poem about it.
Mm-hmm.
Because they say that it helps you find peace with that thing with that emotional challenge you're struggling with. Because by nature of poetry, again, it's rigid, it's structured, and it makes you logically think to an extent of how to bring order to those emotions, how to express those emotions.
Mm-hmm.
Poetry is about communicating kind of the inner world, the deeper inner feeling of something. If you get into Norse mythology, for example, they'd say that Odin, again, I'm not saying I'm not like a pagan or something like that, but I'm just saying mythology.
Yeah.
In Norse mythology, they'd say Odin would be the patron god of poetry, which a lot of people think like Valhalla and the war, heaven of warriors. No, he was the god of poetry.
Wow.
Of many other things, because they tend to say this and that about it. The myth would be of this musician, this great poet that existed in one of their ancient societies, who they say was killed by dwarves, and the dwarves made wine out of his blood, which would then grant them his skills. And again, this is the myth, right?
Mm-hmm.
Would then grant them his skills with poetry. The blood was then captured by one of the ice giants. Odin tricked one of the giants because he wanted to make this a gift to mankind. And so, through a long series of incidents, manages to steal this poet blood wine from the ice giant and gives it to mankind. Mm-hmm. And they believe that from that, of course, people were given poetry, much like you have, in many different beliefs and cultures, gods giving gifts to people that they then use, right? The Greeks would talk about the gift of the olive or the gift of fire, which is a whole other thing in itself.
Yeah.
And, so on and so on, right? The point being, though, that, again, even in a very harsh, very rough tradition, poetry was recognized as a masculine art. Mm. And there's some interesting examples of this. In fact, look right here. The Icelandic sagas. If you're a fan of folio, you know this one.
Yeah.
Right? It's a great book. Actually, the Icelandic sagas, they even contain the two sagas of the discovery of the United States, of the early Americas.
Oh, wow.
And it's really interesting, actually. People talk about Leif Erikson and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. There's two sagas traditionally written that tell the story of them discovering America and what happened. It's really it's interesting stuff. The Icelandic sagas are kind of funny because they're really dry. Mm-hmm. Like, the way of writing is really dry. And so they'll be like, but they're like mythology still. So they'll, in the one where they discover America, they talk about how, like, they're sailing on their boat and a monopod, which if you've read C.S. Lewis's books, the little guys who hop around on one foot, one of them comes out of nowhere and shoots one of the guys with the bow and arrow in the groin, and he dies. And the book basically, like the writing is, we saw a monopod. He shot so and so in the groin. He died, and like that's
Just like
it's about the extent to which
done.
they express it. You know what I mean? But I'm getting off point. But back to the idea of poetry. There's a lot of great poems as well. In fact, I'll give you an example of how this was applied. One of the greatest poets they had, actually, he had 3 sons, and all 3 of his sons died.
Oh God.
And he blamed the gods for that. He was saying, I've served you all of my life. I've prayed to you. You've taken my sole joy from me. And he turned against heaven, basically. What ended up happening, though, is he wrote a poem about it. And it's a very long poem. It's considered one of the best poems of the Icelandic culture. And in the beginning of the poem, he's angry. He's spiteful. He feels that he was robbed of his joy by heaven itself. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And by the end of the poem, he thanks the gods for the gift of poetry. Mm. Because through the process of writing it, he made peace with his emotions. Mm-hmm. And again, emphasizing that point of how other cultures also viewed poetry like that. It brings a type of balance to you. And I think that element of poetry is what we've really lost, I think. And that element of poetry, when you're engaged in, again, I know some people like free verse. Be my guest. But it doesn't have that structure that has that type of balance that made, I think, poetry as attractive and universal as it used to be. Free verse tends to be very personal. It's you trying to get something out of your system, essentially. But it's not something that people will enjoy reading, I think, typically, which is why I think people aren't as interested in it.
I was going to say, so I was just thinking, you're describing like how poetry used to be and how it is now. Is that indicative of like the culture we live in nowadays, and that we're more self-focused instead of outward focused? I don't know. How would you like view that?
I'd agree with you. I think that's definitely part of it. I do think that people, I don't think intentionally, actually. I think people these days feel very lonely. And it's one of the real ironies of technology, where technically we're more connected than we've ever been in all of human history.
Yeah.
We're constantly in your phone is the name and ability to contact any person in your family or any of your friends in any part of the world. You can jump on Twitter and send a message to Elon Musk or Donald Trump. You can, if you turn on the TV and you don't like something they say, you can type them and say, I'm really mad at you right now. And they'll probably read it and get slightly offended. You know what I mean? Like you have that ability now, which people in the past did not have. If you wanted to go protest the government, you had to go walk, 1,000 miles and, go throw your shoe at them or something like that. Like these days we're technically more connected, but in a funny way, we become more isolated. And I do think that to an extent, you could say that the loss of these arts is maybe part of that, where we've become disconnected. And I think that's partly because we've become disconnected as well from tradition and national identity and culture. I'm like super mixed race, and so I tend to just study all cultures.
Yeah.
I can say I'm like this or that. People of those races would not consider me part of their race. That's just the reality. I have no illusions about this. You know what I mean? I can say I'm like, like British or Hawaiian or Filipino. None of those cultures would recognize me as one of them because I'm too mixed race. They'd be like, no, you're an American. Quit trying to tell us you're something else. You identity stealing American, But on that note too, I think we underappreciate the American identity as well. But that's a whole other topic. But getting into it as well, I think also that because we become disconnected from these cultures, we forget the value of what they offered and these traditions. And I think that people, for example, engaging in poetry, have also forgotten the value of structure and form. Not only the emotional element, but in the way that poetry works, that because it's structured, because it's rigid, it forces you to think differently of how to express something. I mentioned that my form of writing, and maybe my way of speaking to some extent, is more based on poetry. Like I read a lot of poetry. And I used to have a habit of trying to write like a poem every day, in fact. The value of it, partly, is it forces you to think differently.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the sayings of poetry is you make the strange familiar and the familiar strange.
Yeah.
You don't just show people a flower because they've seen it a million times.
Mm-hmm.
You try to show it to them in a way where they feel they're seeing it for the first time.
Yeah.
You don't show them some random thought you've had that no one can relate to.
Mm-hmm.
You try to make the strange familiar. You try to make this unrelatable thing relatable.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another challenge of poetry. And another thing that makes poetry very, I think, interesting to read. You know, it's something that makes Shakespeare interesting to this day. My personal favorite poet, an ancient Chinese poet named Liu Bei, his name slips my mind now.
Well, I don't know.
Ancient Chinese poet. I'll remember it in a bit.
Okay.
But, you know, an ancient Taoist poet, beautiful stuff. He writes about, dancing alone with his shadow and so on. You know,
Mm-hmm.
that he's drinking alone with his shadow, that he's on a mountaintop alone, and his only company is the moon and his shadow, and they're drinking together, and he talks about his experience with it. It's just slight things that seem kind of stupid when you just say them, but when you can express them in a way that it makes the experience into something that you would not normally see it on the surface, because it's telling you his inner feeling with that, and even relaying to some extent like a deeper meaning.
Yep.
That they're communicating not just a circumstance or just an event, but the inner feeling of that event, which inspired them to write the poem in the first place. And I think that's something that prose doesn't capture that well.
Mm-hmm.
And if you get into people like, for example, J.R.R. Tolkien, you know, he integrated poetry with prose in his writing, which I think is also what adds so much depth and feeling to his stories, which makes it something. It makes it more of an experience than just a story.
Well, why it's lasted so long and why so many people gravitate to it like years and years and years later.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do think, too, that, there's something universal about it. Mm-hmm. Even in terms of pattern and sound, there's a reason why the old Irish folktales have the universal, I think, lasting influence they do. Why, for example, traditional music, you know, we still listen to Mozart and so on. Maybe some of us, to some extent, not because it's poetry per se, but because it follows certain patterns of sound that are just naturally harmonious. Even in fact, some of the current songs that are popular now, like I can listen to some pop songs these days, and I'm like, I know which folk song they ripped that melody off from.
Oh,
I know which classical song they stole that melody from. You know, there's a real popular rap song I hear when I'm taking Uber sometimes that's based on Canon and D.
Yeah, that's
like,
awesome.
You hear it all the time these days, you know?
And so it just like, it has that familiarity that we're like, ooh, I like that. And so then it sticks with us.
Yeah.
And so have you been writing poetry for like, when did you start?
You know, I wasn't that into it until I got a bit older. As funny as it may sound, people, you know, watching my show may be surprised. I was not a very good student. When I was in school, the only thing I cared about was like martial arts. I used to train very hard with martial arts, and I couldn't care less. I couldn't have cared less about school. I traveled a lot. You know, my dad owned a restaurant. In the summers, I'd work at his restaurant. In the winters, we'd go to Costa Rica. My dad was a big surfer. And so I would take like 3 months off of school a year. And when I came back, I'd be really far behind because I hadn't been like learning math for 3 months or something. You know, they'd give me homework, but you know, they didn't really give me homework. And so I was not a very good student. Most of what I know is just from reading books. I'm heavily self-educated.
Yeah.
But you know, when it comes to poetry, I think I got more into it when I was probably 19, I think was when I started, and I just continued with it as just out of interest, and you know, here I am now, basically.
That's awesome. Okay, and so I think about this a lot in terms of like people who are like right of center or more conservative or whatever.
Real quick, the Chinese poet, my favorite one, Li Bai, Libai. Those of you curious.
There we go. Okay, So I think about this a lot of where people right of center, people conservative, I feel like they view politics influencing culture instead of the reverse, which is culture influencing politics, which is, I think, how things work. The culture influences policies. And so, why or why not, you can disagree with me, do you feel like people, maybe right of center, on the right, conservative, don't value art, poetry, creativity as much, or don't like lift it up as much? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Why?
I fully agree.
Mm-hmm.
And, and it ties into something I've been reflecting on a lot lately too, which is how do we restore social harmony?
Mm-hmm.
Are we really too far gone? And, Elon Musk tweeted something out interesting that I kind of felt as well, that he said what he's going for is essentially the 80% in the middle. He said he's actually glad that the extreme right and the extreme left are both equally mad at him. They both
Mm-hmm.
equally seem to hate him.
Mm-hmm.
One problem we have in our society, in other words, there is maybe that 80%, the majority on the right and the left, who are still decently reasonable,
Mm-hmm.
and who, even though we might disagree with each other to some extent, we can still, through reason, have conversations and maybe change each other's opinions to some extent.
Yeah.
There's a lot of independence in America. There's a lot of people who don't really affiliate with one party or the other.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the unfortunate reality is the centrist left, because of the political divides, views the centrist right only by the extremes of the right.
Mm-hmm.
And the centrist right only views the centrist left by the extremes of the left.
Yep.
And I think that's kind of where a lot of our conflicts are at, actually.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to view each other through the examples of the worst
Yep.
of the other side. And we don't recognize maybe that the people on the other side very often maybe disagree with the extremes. Or at the very least don't fully adopt them.
Mm-hmm.
That maybe they tolerate them to some extent because they feel, this is my tribe.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This is my tribe. Yeah, that guy in the tribe's a little crazy. I don't think I think he's crazy. I don't agree with him, but he's my tribe. And I think this kind of tribalist party mentality is the source of a lot of our conflicts.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I think there has to be a way to break that to some extent, where the people on the right can disavow the extremes, and the people on the left can disavow the extremes, and we'll find that actually we've been kind of forced into a false. I know I hate the phrase, but a false dichotomy.
Yeah.
Whereas the center, the 80% center, should be almost a party in itself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to an extent society needs that. I think that when you push things to an extreme, you are going to flip-flop from one extreme to the other. Mm-hmm. Politically, some people might desire that. They might desire that, but they don't realize that one causes the other.
Yep.
I was watching, because of the whole Kanye West thing and the Nick Fuentes thing, I was watching some of the interviews to kind of get an idea of it. And maybe I like, when I watch things, I tend to like think and reflect. And so I was off on maybe mental tangents that I wasn't paying attention to the surface arguments, in other words. Because one thing they were talking about was the idea of basically forcing people to be Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And, that was his whole thing. They think there should be anti-blasphemy laws. They don't realize what that means. It sounds very nice on paper. That I understand where they're coming from. They think that you can force people to be moral.
You can't.
They think the problems we have in society because people have disavowed tradition and morality and forgotten God, basically, which I would agree with. I would agree with that to some extent, But you can't force that on people. Mm-mm. If you force it on people, what you're going to end up with is basically the same thing you have in most Islamic countries. You're going to be like ISIS, where the religion is forced on people, people don't necessarily believe in it per se, and they see people who hold the extremes of it typically as hypocrites. Mm-hmm. In other words, in some ways it damages religion when you force it like that. And I think that part of the problem we had with the Enlightenment and with the moving away from God and modern liberalism to some extent was because of that factor you had with the Catholic Church in Europe, a conflict that America is mostly disconnected from. Mm-hmm. America being founded by Protestants who actually were very different in their beliefs between different states. Mm-hmm. people talk about America being a Christian country. Yeah, that's true to some extent, but you had a lot of varieties of that, and a lot of them didn't agree with each other. A lot of them actually really didn't like each other,
Yeah.
and a lot of them viewed the other one as like crazy cults and stuff like that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The founding fathers coming together in the way they did to find agreement and to find common ground despite their differences was what allowed us to create a society, to create a country. And a country is based on the idea of people of different opinions being able to tolerate the differences that exist between us. People talk about the idea of diversity destroying a society. To some extent, I'd say that a society is formed by a culture, or at the very least, a common idea of what you are.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would agree with that to some extent. But you can look at societies that did achieve otherwise. The Roman Empire is a great example of that, which was North Africa, Greece, Southern Europe, Italy, and so on, right? And other countries too. Ironically destroyed by mostly the Germans and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But it's beside the point. In other words, you had different religions.
Mm-hmm.
You had Africans and you had Europeans and you had Greeks and so on, who came together despite different cultures and despite different religions and formed a country and maintained their differences while understanding the value of maintaining also a cultural identity through the nation itself. And I think the problem we're having these days is we're losing sight of that. Mm-hmm. That we think people have to conform to us if we're going to have a functioning society. Yeah. And what I'm getting into here is I think the extremities of tolerance. There are extremes. The right side extreme is saying that no possible social harmony can exist as long as there are differences between us to some extent. The left is saying we can't have a society without diversity to its most extreme levels, where they want us to tolerate things that are just poo-poo crazy, like just the craziest things you could possibly imagine. Like, no, I'm not going to tolerate you wanting to castrate my child. I'm sorry. That is crazy. If you want to dress like a dog and take photos as a military officer, hey man, do you, but I think it's crazy. I think you're insane. I tolerate your insanity, but I think you're insane. And I reserve my right to say, I think you're crazy. And it ties into the idea too of religion, going back to that when you try to force your beliefs on others, typically you're going to find, I think you're often going to create the opposite. Mm-hmm. Especially when you try to push it to an extreme where you're pushing almost like an absolute morality, because everybody's flawed. And people are going to see your flaws and they're going to call you a hypocrite. Mm-hmm. And because they see your flaws and call you a hypocrite, they're going to take that out also on the belief you're trying to force upon them. Yeah. They're saying, who are you to tell me this? And, even the religious reforms in Europe were part of that. It was criticisms of the Catholic Church, the Protestant reforms. Criticisms of the Catholic Church saying you're preaching this, but you're violating everything you're preaching. Not just the church, but even the governments. In fact, if you ever want to read something interesting, look at the early Bibles that the Protestants had, including the Pilgrims. And my grandma on my mom's side, I can trace them back to the Mayflower, in fact.
Wow.
And so, but the people in the Mayflower, if you read the Protestant Bible, it had like side notes on the margins that just had criticisms of the kings and of Europe on all the things they were violating in the religion they're trying to force on people. Getting back to the idea of what you were asking about, the balance between right and left and like social harmony and stuff. I think we need to recognize that it's okay to be different. Mm-hmm. It's okay to not agree with each other. Mm-hmm. And maybe younger generations these days have a harder time understanding this. But when I was a kid, I didn't think of it at the time. I had my friend group was the black kid and the Native American kid and the Italian kid. And I never viewed them as black or Native American or Italian. It never occurred to me. I come from a mixed race family. My dad's family, my grandma was Hawaiian Filipino. My grandpa was a white Polish Marine, and he is. My grandpa on the other side, Czech, mixed. My grandma British, and so on. Right. I grew up in a mixed race household, very American.
Mm-hmm.
But my grandma's side, they ate Filipino food, and we did Hawaiian dance growing up. Me and my cousins and my aunts, we all did hula. It never occurred to me why my white family didn't eat rice. I just thought they weren't very good at cooking rice. Whereas with my grandma's family, every single meal we had rice. It didn't occur to me until years and years later that, it's a race thing, it's a cultural thing, and that's why my white family isn't into it. When I was a kid, the concept didn't even occur to me. It's just one family eats different food than the other; they must just have different recipes. Mm-hmm. These things never occurred to me. When I was a kid, I had friends who were like really far left, and I would disagree with them, like, yeah, you're crazy, dude. I took a test when I was in high school on like political alignment because one of the teachers had us do it, and they put me as Rush Limbaugh. When I'm like sophomore in high school. But I had friends who were pretty far left, and we disagreed with each other, and we were not going to see eye to eye. I was even as a kid, very pro Second Amendment. Mm-hmm. I had friends who thought that owning guns were like a crime against humanity just by the very nature of owning them, and we disagreed. But there were never hard feelings. There was never anger or hatred or dislike because of that. Mm-hmm. And even culturally, in the 90s, we used to make fun of each other like all the time.
You can make fun of people?
Yeah, we used to make fun of each other all the time. And it was not mean. It was not ill-spirited. It was teasing each other on our differences. And we respected our differences, but we still teased each other because we thought it was funny. And nobody got offended. That type of culture, in other words, that allows us to maintain our culture, to maintain what makes us unique, while allowing others to maintain what makes them unique, and recognizing our differences and joking about them and respecting them, while not feeling we have to conform to them. Mm-hmm. That is what allows you to create a country that is of mixed beliefs and mixed cultures and mixed ideas. And this idea that we should just homogenize the whole thing, just take a blender to it and make it all the same, to me, that's terrifying. Yeah. I would not want to live in a country where people are all the same. I want people to disagree with me. Mm-hmm. I want people to fact check me and to question me. In fact, I read criticisms of myself all the time. I don't write it off. In fact, I'll probably acknowledge some of the legitimate criticisms of my last episode. In fact, this week, where people pointed out that maybe I gave too much weight to a story that probably doesn't have as much importance as it does. Mm-hmm. I'll acknowledge that. I'm glad people pointed it out to me. Mm-hmm. But again, to me, that's what tolerance is. And I think we've lost sight of the true meaning of tolerance. Mm-hmm. Tolerance is not adoption. Tolerance does not mean you recognize everything as good. Mm-hmm. There are many things that I will say I believe are immoral and I disagree with. It does not mean I hate the people who do it. Mm-hmm. I disagree with homosexuality. I don't want it. I don't want my kids learning it. I don't think it's good. I have friends who are gay. I don't care. I don't judge them. I don't think badly of them. I don't look down on them. I have my values. They have their values, and we respect each other between that. I have my own religion. I hang out with people of many different religions. I don't try to force my religion on them. They don't try to force it on me. Mm-hmm. But we can have very interesting religious discussions about different values and different ideas. Again, it's the idea that you can see things that you do not want to adopt yourself. And there are reasons you don't want to adopt it yourself. Mm-hmm. And you would even maybe criticize it in others to some extent. But you can still respect them for it. Mm-hmm. You can still respect them as people who are just on different tracks of life, and you understand that. And it doesn't mean you can't be friends with them. Yeah. To me, that's what tolerance is.
For sure. And I was just thinking, like, as you're talking, I think, like, this is how art and creativity and poetry, I feel like, bridges the gap between all human beings, because we all have that desire to create, to share, to connect. And so I think that's why probably you gravitated towards poetry. We love reading it, is because it's not always just the cut and dried this and that. It's like our inner feelings, our inner thoughts shared, and we connect through that. So
yeah. Do you think... and you're asking another question that was interesting too, which was about conservatives not understanding the value of culture.
Yes, of like art and like lifting that up.
as someone who, in my work, has spent a lot of time investigating Chinese Communist Party espionage and stuff, their main focus is ideology. Culture warfare for them is a category of warfare. In fact, written in their military code as culture warfare. Drug warfare is also part of that, to destroy the moral fabric of the youth. They view morality and ideology and culture as basically the building blocks of a society. And if you can destroy those things, you can destroy the society. If you look at Yuri Bezmenov, the Soviet defector who warned about what the Soviets were doing, the secret war on America, he talked about ideological subversion, the subversion of ideology itself. And a lot of conservatives, they don't recognize that. They tend to view things in a more practical way of like the, economics or the building blocks and politics of society. Whereas the left was always focused on culture and ideas and ideology, which is, and when we debate, we tend to go like this. We're talking about things they don't care about, and they're talking about things we don't care about. They're saying how they feel,
we're on two totally different planes.
And we're talking about like, money and stuff like that. And they're like, I don't care about any of that. Like, we're talking over each other's heads now, and we're not finding common ground. If you were to ask me, though, I'd actually agree to some extent. I think conservatives miss this, and I think, liberals maybe miss some of it too. So this is where I'm at. A society, what we're really debating with politics is not necessarily like the politics themselves. What we're debating is morality. We're having moral debates. Guns and the right to self-defense is a moral debate. Abortion is a moral debate. It's not about, it's about whether you believe an infant that's unborn has a soul. It's a religious debate to some extent. Do you believe in a soul? Do you believe in that that's life and that life should be cherished, or do you believe it's just a clump of cells? Right? It's belief in religion that we're debating, and really laws and structures, which government creates laws, and that's kind of the structure. That's the nature of government itself, right? And creates some kind of like national defense, right? It's all based on the idea of morality. And it's always been a question of how, this is where the left falls short, is how do you maintain a society essentially without laws? And then if you eliminate laws, what is society? What is a government at that point? What does a government even represent? They believe a government is more like a provider than something that brings order. You know what I mean? Which is why they tend to view it as like more like from a socialist perspective, right? They believe it's your protector. It's not something there necessarily to ensure that you as a sovereign individual don't harm others and so on, right? But back to the idea of culture and values. So basically politics is based on essentially moral debates. Those moral debates are based on religious debates, and those religious debates are based on whatever religion you have. Culture is an outcropping of belief. Culture is an outcropping of religion. And, really it's these deeper things that form that, right? And so I think that conservatives, ironically, tend to be more religious. They tend to be typically Christian. I think it's changing now because even the church is kind of going woke to some extent. But again, even there, it's a debate on values and culture and belief and stuff like that. I was reflecting on, because I do a lot of stuff exposing communism and Marxism. Marx would argue that societies are basically formed by technology, which is funny because a lot of modern communists, I think, believe in the abolition of the factories and the abolition of capitalism and so on. Communism doesn't do that. It tries to basically take those things and put them under government ownership, right? Give it to the people. Ironically, private ownership, I'd say, is more to the people than the government owning it, because the government then becomes its own social class. But Marx argued basically, for the factories. If you read Das Kapital, by the end of it, he's praised this whole idea of like this kind of cyberpunk future, so to speak, where, you have factories and high technology and so on. He's arguing for this imaginary future. But he again, I was reflecting on this idea that he's arguing, the age of the printing press and the age that basically societies are formed by the technologies and by the innovations. And I don't think it's true, actually. Maybe it's true to some extent that the technologies can alter a society, but I'd say actually it's not really true, because the Roman Empire had advanced technologies that were forgotten after it fell.
Mm-hmm.
You would think there would be like kind of a continuity after it fell if the idea of like technological evolution existed. Same with many cultures. The people afterwards forgot even like how to build roads the way the Romans did, forgot how to build houses the way the Romans did, or the aqueducts and plumbing the way the Romans did. Rome was not formed by those things. Rome was formed by values. Ancient dynasties were formed by values. Ancient societies were formed by values. It's not the technological innovations that form a society, in other words. It's the religions, it's the beliefs and the cultures that form societies. And they do develop over time as long as social harmony can be maintained. And social harmony, I believe, is based actually on culture and religion. Again, right? That's the idea of how do we interact with each other? What are the standards of moral interaction? How do we maintain harmony with each other? If you look at what religions, again, there's different deviations of this, but look at what they teach. It's mostly how to have harmonious interactions with other human beings. Mm-hmm. Don't steal from them. Don't kill them. So on. Don't lie to them. There's certain values that inform us what is a good way to interact with each other. Mm-hmm. And the fabric of social harmony is then built on this, and cultures are then built on the different beliefs that are established by these ideas of social harmony. I think conservatives, they recognize this, but they don't recognize the culture war. Mm-hmm. And I think the war these days against the idea that values even exist or morality even exists. Yep. I would put communism outside of the whole dichotomy of normal right and left. Mm-hmm. It is something that believes in the absolute destruction of all concepts of culture and religion, yes, no matter where you stand. The abolition of all ideas, all previously existing institutions. It is something that looks to completely destroy everything that mankind was, and even the memory of what it once was. And I think, which is why I really fundamentally oppose it. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we should even put that within our normal dichotomy of like political debate. It is something beyond extreme. And again, I'll say it as I've said on my show, that even fascism and socialism are socialist ideas. They're parts of this as well. And if you want to argue about extreme left and extreme right, the irony is most of them are part of the same basic political ideology, socialism, which is based on which is one of the theories of communism. And that's kind of how I think I view that whole issue.
Yeah.
Long explanation of it.
Yeah, and I know you have another interview to do. So for people that want to get into poetry or always have these thoughts, how would you say is like a good way to start? Do they need to read the greats, just start writing? What would you say?
I would say buy a book on forms. Not to plug Society of Classical Poets, but we do have guides on how to start writing poetry, including different tiers of like difficulty. Mm-hmm. I'd recommend just start with one form. Don't try to learn every form. I personally, I'm a big fan of the Shakespearean sonnet. Mm-hmm. Anybody interested? Actually, I believe the Shakespearean sonnet is decently challenging while being easy enough to learn that it's not that difficult.
Yeah.
My personal favorite would be Old English poetry, actually, which unfortunately is an art that's mostly lost, although you can read the Poetic Eddas, which give guides on how the Norse did it. And one of the few people who tried restoring it actually was J.R.R. Tolkien, and he has some very interesting writings on how it worked. His book called The Fall of Arthur actually has an interesting guide written by his son Christopher Tolkien in the back that talks about some of his ideas on it. And the book is written in Old English poetry. It's fantastic. Mm-hmm. It's so good. Unfortunately, he never finished it.
I know.
It's such a tragedy. It's so good. It just has this beat to it. it's not a rhyming poetry. It's based on this up and down beat that just builds this intensity, and it's based on this kind of like inner feeling. Interestingly, that's more traditional with the English language than are, the sonnets and so on, which ironically are more based on the Romantic languages like Italian or Spanish. Languages that a lot of the words are masculine or feminine. They rhyme by nature of ending with a or o. Those poetic forms were not technically built for the English language. So I do like old English poetry, although you're going to have a very hard time learning it, and so I don't recommend starting with it because most of it's lost.
Yes.
Frankly, yeah, it's hard to put together because of that.
Okay, and so
but your point, yeah, the Society of Classical Poets has some guides, which is classicalpoets.org.
Okay. And that's where they can see. And can they see your poetry there, or where can they see some examples of yours?
I have some poetry there. It's like really old poetry and some poetry that these days I probably would not write. So I kind of feel embarrassed about some of it.
Oh no! I feel like all artists they write it and they put it out there and then they're like, I hate it, and then they just.
No, I do. I do. Except for like some of the later ones I wrote. I did one about a dream I had of a knight like fighting a demon that it's written in Old English poetry. I wrote a poem written in Old English poetry of Odin's vision at Mimir's well, which was more. It was actually I'm restating a myth of how Odin lost his eye. And that myth, it was terribly butchered recently by that Viking movie. I can't remember the name of
Northman,
where they said. Yeah, I was so disappointed. That movie is not about traditional Norse belief. It's about witchcraft disguised as traditional belief, which I think is a butchering of the religion. But no, so they say that why did Odin lose his eye? He did it to learn the ways of women. No, he lost his eye because, in the myth at least, his two ravens went out into the world and saw some great calamity and came back and warned him. And he wanted to figure out how to avoid this huge calamity. He gave his eye at the roots of the world at Mimir's well, which was the well of wisdom, so that he could gain the wisdom on how to destroy, how to fight back against this evil that would emerge, he believed, at the end of days. And when he gave one of his eyes is the toll, essentially, to have a drink from the well. And when he drank it, he basically saw the battle between good and evil that would take place. And the solution he had was to build a heaven for warriors who would train for all these years to fight in the last battle between good and evil. And the poem, again, I'm not like a pagan, don't get me wrong. I just enjoy folk tales and mythology. Yeah. I read most mythology. The tale was actually my own reflections on current politics, where it feels that good and evil are clashing, and how do you deal with what seems like an insurmountable challenge, an insurmountable force of evil that feels like it's going to tear the whole world down? Odin's answer was build an army of righteous people, and to foster and strengthen righteousness. And to me, that's such a deep, beautiful concept. And
yeah.
The poem, although maybe not visible on the surface, is my reflections on that principle through the retelling of that. And so you can read that poem there. And then I also have one when they were tearing down the Confederate statues. Although I disagree with the Confederates, don't get me wrong. My discontent with the idea of destroying traditional culture and destroying history and our memory of it.
Yeah.
I wrote a poem about that as well. So those are three that I still like.
Okay.
But the other ones I don't like. Yeah.
And thank you so much again for talking to me today. Yeah. Where can people follow you on social media or anything like that?
My Twitter is at Josh J. Philipp, Philipp. And of course, I do my show Crossroads on Epoch TV, EPOCHTV.com.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for your time. And I hope people get to read your poetry and know you more in that realm. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Pleasure.